Okay. So now it's over to Dr. Sanjeev Sehgal for conducting the panel discussion. Sanjeev, you can take over
Thank
from
you.
there.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
sir.
sir.
Thank you.
Right. I think these two have been extremely interesting and very insightful talks. And before we move to the panel discussion, I think there's one thing which I like Dr. Aura's talk was, he really, gave a good basic sciences background. We have a talk on tolerance in liver transplantation later on as a inaugural address. So just one question to Dr. Anil. Like you have spoken beautifully about the various pathways. So what do you think is the main bottleneck in in our challenge or failure to develop tolerance in transplantation, sir?
You see, it, as I mentioned in the very beginning, by default, liver keeps on taking huge amount of the antigen from the ingestants in the GI tract. So 2/3 of the blood flow to the liver is from the portal vein, and you have innumerable bacteria, mycobacteria, and microbiome which goes up, including the dietary components. So liver by default is supposed to be tolerogenic. That is the reason this is the only organ in which you do not need to match an HLA before you do. And even if there is a HLA mismatch, I give you 3 reasons: because of the dilution of the DSAs, and because of the soluble antigens coupling with the DSAs and being engulfed by the Cooper cells. This may be the reason why we do not develop antibody-mediated response. But with passage of time, because of the injury, because you see, the MHCs are expressed on the donor cells in the vascular endothelium and in the biliary tract. So which is a foreign antigen. So they are the persistent stimuli to the T cells. And once T cells get activated, then they do not see whether the offending agent was vascular endothelium or the biliary tract, and ultimately hepatocytes get damaged. So somehow if we are able to raise the Treg stimulation, if you want to jack up the Treg stimulation and try to tone down T cells by changing the microenvironment of the liver, maybe we will have more tolerogenicity.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Dr. Sanjeev Sehgal as a moderator for panel discussion on the practice of immunosuppression across various liver transplant centers in India. And the panelists for this session are Dr. S. Sunindra. He is a clinical professor and chief transplant surgeon in Amrita Institute of Medical Science, Kochi. Dr. Vivek Beach, director and chief liver transplant surgeon, Fortis Hospital, Delhi. Dr. Dinesh Jyotimani, director hepatology and medical gastroenterology in Dr. Rela Institute, Chennai. And Dr. Narendra Chaudhary, senior consultant and liver HPV surgeon in Medanta Hospital, Gurgaon. And Dr. Tyagarajan Srinivasan, Senior Consultant and Director, Institute of Liver Disease Transplant and HPV Surgery at MGM Healthcare, Chennai. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the panel discussion now. Let me share my slides. So what I think was interesting is that I decided that we'll have a panel discussion on practice of immunosuppression in liver transplant at the very beginning of the course, so that we understand what we are doing right now, and then we can judge from the next 2 days or this end of the proceedings whether our practice is really the right thing or we need to change into it. So this was a practical oriented panel, and what I did was we designed a questionnaire which was sent to all the liver transplant centers across country, both living donor and DDLT. And of these 17 centers, gave full responses, and those were meaningful. And I think we then analyze these responses and try to generate a panel discussion as towards the current practice. Is it the correct one? Should we change? This is not a recommendation sort of thing. This is more as a practical what is being done. Like Charles had beautifully mentioned about various scenarios, how to deal. So let us see what actually we do in our country, and then with greater knowledge, maybe we will be able to understand more about immunosuppression in transplantation. So to start with, the question which was put was in the intraoperative period. What is the dose of methylprednisolone which you would like to use? Usually surgeons, they are handling this part of the thing, and would anybody would take up this before I tell what exactly we got. So anybody would like to answer this? What is the intraoperative dose of methylprednisolone in an average liver transplant, and do you change it in a given setting?
Sanjeev, Sudhi here. Hi.
Yeah, Sudhi, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Our policy is to give 10 milligram per kilogram, so which means roughly it'll be about 600 milligram to 1 gram at the time of just before perfusion, reperfusion. That's it.
Right. I think. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, Vivek. Hi. How are you?
Oh, very good, Vivek. Hi. Good to see you, Vivek.
Hi,
Thank you
Vivek.
very much. Hi, Sudhi. So our standard practice is to give 500 milligram in anhepatic phase, and for very sick patients, we come down even further to 250, and sometimes for very, very sick patients, we have omitted the steroid dose per pulse also.
Very interesting. This is typically, what I've always heard to my, surgical colleagues and anesthetists, that they have this feel of the patient in the OT, and that's something only they can tell. And what Vivek is trying to convey, I understand that you can actually, modify based on patient's condition. And what we, saw from the survey, that average dose, which is given 500 mg, is commonest, followed by about 1000 mg. But 10 mg per kg body weight is what is, accepted one. And as Dr. Viz is telling, I would completely endorse that in a given sicker patient, septic patient, you may have to, modify and lower your dosages, which is fair enough. Now, we just, come on to the post-operative period. And as we started with methylprednisolone intraoperatively, let me in the same flow try and, discuss how would you like to taper it? Like once you've given the entropic bolus, patient has come to the ICU, he's started to do well. So what would be a tapering off policy? Like how soon or how late would you like to, taper it off? So this is something which maybe, Dinesh or anybody that can answer this.
Hi, Sanjeev. Good evening.
Hi, Dinesh.
It's good.
So from the
so usually what we do is we give 20 milligram prednisolone, which is around 16 milligrams methylprednisolone. Most centers give 16 milligrams of IV methylprednisolone. We used to give higher doses, but over the last decade, all this immunosuppressive doses cut down on that. So 16 milligram methylprednisolone for the first 4 to 5 days, and then convert into 20 milligrams oral prednisolone. At the same time, you start other immunosuppressive medication, as you show in the further slide.
Narinder, what was your thought? Take on this, Narinder.
Sir, we use 1 mg per kg, so and we taper 10 mg per day till we reach 30. So if a patient is 70, then it will be 70 mg, 60 mg, 50, 40, then 30. And from 30, it is gradual tapering in 3 months.
I mean, me and Narinder, we have been together for years, so I think this is what we've been following, and is honestly, is echoing what my thoughts would have been. And what we looked at, that nearly 70% agreed that they would taper it off over 5 days, and reduce it, maybe bring it to 10, 15, 20, and some say over a week. There is also a segment which says that it will depend on the LFT. I mean, this is something which is difficult to say. Yes, maybe yes, and you won't rely on the CNI levels at this stage, which I also agree. But I think that again, probably as Vivek had said earlier, the sepsis issue might also guide you as to whether you want to taper it fast or more quickly or delay. I mean, that's again an individual patient. Vivek, any thought on this?
Sanjeev, I think more or less consensus is there that on a second day we give around 80 to 100 milligram dose, then taper it off by 10 or 20 milligrams till we come to 10, 20 or 30 methylpred, and when patient is comfortable, switch it to oral dose. I think more important question is first week is very critical for every patient. Now this happens in a patient which is very stable patient, everything is going well. Now there is definitely a chunk of patients who are showing SIRS / sepsis in the first week. Their tachycardia is there, or in those patients, I think it's important to discuss the strategy of immunosuppression as well as steroid tapering. As far as steroid tapering is concerned, I think in those cases, we like to persist at a stable dose of steroids for some time till the time we resume the immunosuppression level. I think that is our strategy for first week, rather than just blindly tapering the dose to around 20 or 30 milligram at the end of 1 week.
Yeah, I was expecting this issue, and so there will be a dedicated lecture by Dr. Sudhindran, and that's on immunosuppression in sepsis. So I think that is, I think the difficult part of immunosuppression, and I think Sudhi is going to give a thought-provoking discussion. So we'll not discuss at this stage it further. We'll have a proper talk on the next one, and also just in passing, I mean, basiliximab, we know it's in and out. Some use, some don't use. I mean, I remember initially when we used to use daclizumab, then it went out of the order. Then we start basiliximab. So it does prevent renal dysfunction. It is costly, and some may like to use. Just to mention here that our survey mentioned that 56% would use basiliximab as induction protocol in renal dysfunction. About 43% said no, they will not use. Just maybe any of you, maybe Dinesh, you can say, like, do you have your take on basiliximab? Do you use it or just ignore it completely?
Yeah, I mean, Sanjay, it's depending. Say, for example, if somebody has been on dialysis preoperatively and then it's been the renal function has taken a hit, and it's obviously you're going to protect the kidney for a long time because we know that patients with underlying renal dysfunction in the post-liver transplant period will have a slightly poor outcome. So all the effort should be made to improve the kidney. So definitely, yes, basiliximab is something we use in selected patients. And so that we can delay, the whole idea is to delay the initiation of tacrolimus. But there are some group who will just start low dose tacrolimus per se without just using basiliximab. But again, there are clear-cut clinical trials showing benefit of basiliximab in patients with poor renal function. Yeah, and obviously you need to protect the kidneys.
Dr. Sehgal, can I add a point?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't see your face, Dr. Nagarajan. That's the reason I probably missed you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So it's there, I think. It's there.
I can't see you.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, regarding basiliximab, lot of renal dysfunction patients we want to use. But the actual problem is we have a hunch that a lot of these patients are like Dr. Vivek already said, they are little septic, because in very few patients, if you use this induction, like especially Indian patients who are not that great, just recovered from episode of sepsis, there is a fear that it may tip off the balance. In those patients, we may not use basiliximab, even though we would like to use the basiliximab on most of these renal dysfunction patients. That is one peculiar set of patients we are very hesitant to use basiliximab.
Right. Again,
can I just say,
Sudhindran, I think you have been a proponent of basiliximab, Sudhindran.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So now we are completely on a total steroid off protocol. The only steroid that we give on table, almost 90% of adult patients do get basiliximab. We've actually done the trial. It's published in Journal of Hepatology. It was as good as a steroid regimen with significant decrease in all the metabolic profile, including diabetes, dyslipidemia, all those things. So now we use basiliximab as a routine in almost all patients, unless they do require steroids, for example, autoimmune patients, etc.
When it's steroid free, what is intraoperative and early 4 or 5 days?
Just one intraoperative dose. That's it. Just one intraoperative dose. Nothing more after that. Zero.
Nothing more after that. And you have been having good results. I'm aware of this, which you published. But again, I don't think any other any center, strongly is following this sort of protocol.
The people are worried about the cost, but on the cost analysis at 6 months, the basiliximab arm actually ended up being cheaper because of the decrease in the various other things, etc., etc. So, but anyway, it's just our protocol here.
Okay, interesting. That's again a good benefit of the survey, because I personally would have been more hesitant in using as a blanket, but it's an excellent thing you have done, Sudhindra, and I think we can discuss this later on as well. And this, I think, was discussed in Charles's lecture. Nothing really big. What pulse regimen you would give in rejection? Some say 500 into 3 days. That's the most thing. Some say 1,000 into 3 days. I think, but a question which Dr. Sudhindran asked me, and I would maybe briefly ask any of you. Well, giving a pulse is, I think, probably straightforward. Is no big, like difficult thing. You have a biopsy-driven rejection. Preferably, you give a pulse steroid. Very sick patient who don't like to give a very high dose, 1,000 mg. I don't use Indian patients. I've realized that I don't use that much dose. A question which Dr. Sudhindran wanted to really highlight, and I think it's fair enough. What do you do if you have got a refractory steroid rejection, so that you have resistant rejection? So you have treated with steroids, again patient has not responded, or again inadequate response. So what would you do in such a situation? Maybe any of you can take that up. So refractory rejection. Yeah.
So generally literature recommends ATG. Some literature on anti-IL-2 also. In last several years, we and you together, we have not used ATG. So generally we give 500 into 3 days followed by tapering. If there is rise of enzymes again this dose is repeated, and it is not mandatory that third time again patient will have rise of LFT. In 2 patients we have used basiliximab and they are fine. So no experience.
Yes. Yeah, I think yeah. I mean, yeah, I remember I had sent an abstract in ILTS in 2012-13 when we had 6 patients on ATG who had refractory rejection proven, and I think 5 of them did very well. But again, the last few years, it's very exceptionally uncommon for me to use ATG. But I probably that's the actual scenario these days. Now, maybe we'll move to the next point, which is, well, we all use tacrolimus. I think there's no question about that. But what is important is that under what situations you would like to use cyclosporine? This is, I think, very important question. And this is something which needs to be addressed. So before I open this answer which I got from the survey, maybe any of you could answer. Let me know what is your practice: cyclosporine over tacrolimus in liver transplant.
Generally, we prefer limus, but rarely. Usually, we change to cyclosporine. In the case of, because this tacrolimus neurotoxicity is that in some of these patients, they don't tolerate tacrolimus. So in those patients, we switch over to cyclosporine. But usually what happens is, even they are put on temporarily, after sometimes this neurological thing resolves, you can reintroduce tacrolimus also. That's one thing. Second thing is, sometimes we have seen this tacrolimus induced even liver injury. Rarely, that's not very common. When we change to cyclosporine, even the LFTs stabilize a bit. So these are the 2 which I have used cyclosporine. But generally, we start with tacrolimus.
Yeah.
Very good answer.
Third scenario, I think Sanjeev is in pediatric population, very small kids, because we use syrup and emulsion form. So our practice is to start with the cyclosporine in those cases too.
That's a very practical point. Yeah. So what I think we got from this was, well, tac toxicity. What it means, it probably means that there's a tacrolimus-induced neurotoxicity or liver injury. Then neurotoxicity is probably the commonest cause why you use it. Well, I think I remember this King's College team using cyclosporine in PBC patients. We don't see PBC that much, but that was the favorite of John O'Grady when I was there. And some say we never use it. But I think Dr. Vivek has put a very, I would actually like to add this point here, that in small children, if you have to give your dosages in syrup form, you may have an advantage of cyclosporine syrup. I think that's a reasonably practical suggestion. Now, again, everolimus, people are discussing again. How commonly would you use it in your practice, and how early would you start? We just heard that single agent is not effective, so you really like to combine. And in this early transplant renal dysfunction, that was the one thing which is most people answered. But in practical sense, please, feel free to answer your thing. How often do you use everolimus in your patients? In those of renal dysfunction, do you wait for kidneys to improve, or you just upfront after 2 weeks? Yes, Dr. Vivek, please.
Yeah, Sanjeev. So I am not afraid of everolimus side effects initially in first or 10 days. I think most of the repulsion of everolimus using is because of chances of getting wound disruption, hepatic artery thrombosis. I think that is not the scenario, and many studies have shown that now. So our practice is if there is a renal dysfunction and we are not able to introduce tacrolimus, I blanketly start everolimus, and my 10 to 15% of patients initially in first week might be on some dose of everolimus. This is one thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
And secondly, of course, we give everolimus and steroids. We don't give tacrolimus, but we introduce tacrolimus after 5 to 7 days in a very small dose when the renal functions improve. And then we give a combination of tac and everolimus along with steroid tapering at 3 months. So aim is not to switch the patient completely on everolimus. It's basically to reduce the dose of tacrolimus, which might be more beneficial to patient as far as balance between rejection and kidney dysfunction is being kept.
I mean, you have a good point, but my feeling is that maybe others can comment on that very quickly.
Yes.
Whether within the first, week or week, 10 days, 2 weeks, would you like to introduce everolimus? I know it is not one-to-one thing, but I mean, maybe Dr. Dinesh Sudhi has put his hand up. Sudhi, please.
I think the worry of hepatic artery thrombosis is probably not true because that was just based on one of the case reports. However,
wound healing?
Wound healing is a worry. Definitely, it's a worry because on my own experience, almost 25 to 30% of patients in everolimus, they got hernias. And wound healing is a worry, definitely a worry. Nonetheless, I have used it in 2 weeks. I mean, I try to wait till a month, if at all possible, but there have been situations where I couldn't use tacrolimus and I've used it in 2 weeks' time. So one of the other reasons when I don't use tacrolimus or maybe cyclosporin is when there's a thrombotic microangiopathy, perhaps secondary to tacrolimus. That's one occasion we'll use everolimus as well.
So one problem with everolimus is everolimus apparently protects these patients when there is a moderate degree of renal dysfunction. If there is some of our patients have severe degree of renal dysfunction, for them even everolimus is not that useful. So I think there is a certain group of patients only where everolimus early introduction will help a lot, because even in severely compromised, even everolimus will cause a problem.
Yeah, basically we use everolimus in the context of renal dysfunction, the long-term HCC, but some of the HCC we can discuss that outside criteria. But certainly everolimus as an adjunct along with low-dose tacrolimus in reducing improving renal function, and usually we wait for a month, as Dr. Sudhindran said, like wound sort of infections and sort of delayed wound healing can be an issue with that. But again, this hepatic artery thrombosis is more with sirolimus and not much seen in terms of with everolimus. But we start at a very low dose. Actually. We don't, I don't know, we start 0.5 twice a day like that, and then titrate it up, and then keep a balance and watch the renal function. And of course, do a urine protein creatinine ratio as well as fasting lipid profile before that. Sometimes it can increase your triglyceride.
Right. I think me and Narendra would have been, discussing this thing on multiple occasions, and I think that HCC, well, it's a point actually that besides the renal issue, HCC patients may benefit, and I think that yes, both sirolimus and everolimus have a role when you have stable graft function. 6-8 weeks down the line, 12 weeks, you may convert. Again, it's an individual choice. Some people don't think that it makes any meaningful thing. One thing which I have found that sometimes those who have got chronic rejection or chronic graft dysfunction for reasons I don't know, which we publish also, who are not responding otherwise and converting to everolimus, they have actually shown good response. Their graft stabilized, and I mean that's my personal feeling that it does help in those guys with chronic graft dysfunction and tacrolimus is on. You add an everolimus thing, and then it actually helps in getting the graft in order. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but that's my experience, and which we actually published earlier on. HCC, I think we have discussed. I mean, although 93% say that they use HCC patient, everolimus HCC patients, I am not sure whether this is biased because converting from tacrolimus to everolimus just on HCC is not a standard thing. There's a benefit, but whether you should do it blanketly, I don't think we can make a recommendation like that.
I'm surprised by that 93.8.
Yeah, I don't know, but that's the survey which said. Yeah. Now, azathioprine, we are aware that it has a limited indication, but maybe Sudhindran, again, he's a proponent of this drug at some time in my understanding, and maybe Dr. Sudhindran can make a comment on this. When do you use azathioprine?
That was a routine drug like 2-3 years ago, most of the time, because we found it quite useful. And as far as MMF, I think most of you would know that there is no head-to-head trial between azathioprine and MMF, which has actually shown a benefit of MMF, apart from the fact that it is 50 times more expensive. But however, we have stopped using it, not stopped, but sort of reduced using it a lot, mainly because when you want to publish your stuff, people keep on, the number one question asking, why are you using azathioprine? Why you so? Just for that, I think we have changed to mycophenolate. But otherwise, I think it's a very, very friendly, patient-friendly drug. There is no bowel side effects. Only problem is thrombocytopenia is certainly more common than mycophenolate. There's no doubt about that. But otherwise, I think it's a very good drug. That's what and so cheap. It's only 7 rupees a tablet.
Yes, right. Yeah, Vivek, any thoughts on that?
Sanjeev, I think very little experience of using azathioprine other than inflammatory bowel disease along with PSC. Very few patients. So
Sir, some figure of veno-occlusive disease is there with AJA. That is not with MMF.
Yeah.
Right. Because I remember this.
True. Yeah, that's
this
true.
was being used by the Vellore team at the very, very early on when they used to do transplant, and then I actually was seeing some patients. It was being frequently used in UK at some stage. This was a fairly good drug, but I would agree that we are not using it in a big
And
way.
also, for some reason, we don't see the TPMT deficiency like what we see in the West, where they can just react immediately with bone marrow suppression.
Yes.
We don't see that here. So
yeah, I would agree with you.
Hepatitis.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful drug actually.
So I mean, there's a comment that if you have concomitant IBD, PSC and concomitant IBD, then as Vivek is telling that this drug may be a drug of choice, but again, perhaps that would be an opportunity to use this drug. And cost is a huge benefit, and I think that is something we should consider. Now, this is I think we have in the last 2-3 slides maybe because we have a time limitation also. So one-sided tacrolimus is again being discussed at all meetings. We have this every ASL or every ASL you go, you have a symposium on that. So before, rather than jumping into our own conclusions, this is the answer which I got. 81% say they use one-sided tacrolimus, 18% say they don't use. I will be honest with you, it's not a standard practice. We would like to use, but it's not that it's used very frequently. So just in yes or no, how many of you are using at this stage one-sided tacrolimus? Maybe Vivek, you're using it?
I am using it very uncommonly. Not more than not more than.
Yeah, we use it very commonly, mainly to stabilize the tacrolimus level if they've been for two indications. One is the compliance issue.
What's your?
We do use it a lot. We actually done a trial as well, which we hopefully published. And the only difference, the problem is that the dose-wise comparison, if you require 1 milligram BD of usual tacrolimus, you will require more than that once a day. So you will probably require 3 milligrams or whatever.
Thagarajan, what about you? In the new center, Thagarajan?
Yeah, basically there's a cost issue. The once a day, they jack up the cost. Correct. So that's a problem. I think it can be used where there is a compliance problem with some of these alcoholics. So maybe, I don't know even whether they will subscribe to this. That is one area where I would like to use, but we don't use that commonly.
Right. And then very briefly, if you really want to start a once a day, right? Very
Yes,
quickly,
sir.
what immediate thing you would like to know that before you switch over? What is your main thing that you would like to know in the patient?
Sir, it will be at same dose of tacrolimus. So if a patient is taking tacrolimus 1 BD, then I will start at 2 OD. Still, TAC levels are little lower, 15 to 20% lower than what is achieved by TAC.
Right.
But
So
rejection,
that is something.
kidney injury, that all remains same. So in non-compliance
Right.
patient, I use.
Right. Okay. So then oral steroid. I think we all know this. I would. This is again we have a session on combined liver kidney transplant immunosuppression, and I think that we will not go into details of this one, but just as a survey that majority 2/3 feel that 3/4 feel that the immunosuppression is same in combined liver kidney as you would see in any other transplant. So this is fine. And the mycophenolate, well, again, nothing really surprising. Only thing that people would like to stop it at 1 year, 43%, and about 2 years, about 37%. Now, just to end my panel discussion today, I think it's very insightful survey because that shows what we have been doing. Like a lot of things what Sudhindran tells is different from practice what other centers would do. So these are a couple of summary statements which are very straightforward. I'm not to read them one by one. Methylpred, basiliximab, use of steroid pulse, they are straightforward. Preferred CNI is tacrolimus, and we know the exceptional situation when you convert to cyclosporin. And everolimus is a preferable drug with or without low dose tacrolimus in patient with kidney dysfunction and pre-transplant SCC. This I agree. If there's an opportunity, you can use that. And once a day, it improves compliance, no question about that. And I think that we probably have to give more credence to once a day, which personally I think it's not being given to that extent. Maybe cost is also an issue. And most would like to taper off oral steroids, whether we do steroid-free immunosuppression or not. I think this is something which we have to see maybe more centers, when we enter into a similar steroid-free protocol, we'll have a better understanding. And autoimmune hepatitis, just to mention that low-dose steroids, one would like to continue, at long term and not stop it. And MMF, one can stop at 1 to 2 years. This is the survey finding. And yes, one point very quickly, those with metabolic dysfunction and renal metabolic syndrome and renal dysfunction, MMF may be continued for longer duration. I personally won't stop it at 1 or 2 years. I'll continue low dose MMF because that's a very, very good indication. And azathioprine, well, we have just heard that very, limited situation where you can use it, but yes, it's at its own rule. So I think that's been a very useful and very interactive session. Thank you very much. We are actually just 2 minutes up the time, and being the person who's guiding this course, I would not like to step over further. I convey my thank you to all of the participants who have answered the survey, and whoever has even given partial response. Thank you very much. And the esteemed faculty today who have been with us, Vivek, Dinesh, Dr. Sudhindran, Tagar, Dr. Narendra, thank you very much. And I close this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You can take as long as you want.
Sir, maybe one question I have last. So,
Okay, burning one.
anybody has experience in this bortezomib or something?
Well, somebody wants to answer that? Bortezomib.
I've used it in steroid refractory rejection following ATG in, I think, 1 or 2 patients. So,
Anything which is exotic and which has not been done, ask Sudhindran, he will have that.
We have used, this is Naveen here,
Non-quixotic.
Dr. Tyagarajan. We have
Yeah.
used it in a patient with AMR.
Oh, okay. Great.
AMR once.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. So I think this bortezomib thing has been used also in some GVHD patients. It is not our own patient. This was in the hematology unit, and he had a liver transplant. And I think this was something, but I cannot comment much on that at this stage. I need to figure out further. But it's an interesting question, Tyagarajan. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So thank you once again. Thank you. And I think I'll close the session now and over to Dr. Shekhar for the next session and proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all the panelists for the excellent discussion. And with this, we conclude our first session. we'll having a short break, and we'll see you again all at sharp 5:30. Thank you.
I would request that everybody during the break, please stay logged on. You can relax, you can unwind, have a glass of water, a cup of tea, but don't log off, please. Stay tuned and we join sharp in the next 7-8 minutes. Thank you so much.